Patricia Mann had a habit of arriving early. Her nursing school classmates remembered it clearly. She would already be seated when others were still filing in, notes open, attention already fixed on whatever came next. She wasn't someone who performed competence. She simply had it. Jesse McBane was different in style, but not in substance. He was warmer in a room, quicker to laugh, the kind of person who made introductions feel easy and conversations feel worth having. What they had together, by the accounts of everyone who knew them, was the kind of relationship that looked effortless from the outside because both people in it were genuinely committed to making it work. On February 12, 1972, they went to a Valentine's Day dance together near the Watts Hospital area in Durham, North Carolina. They were engaged and making plans for a future that felt, on that winter evening, entirely within reach. They left at some point during the night and were never seen alive again. 13 days later, on February 25, 1972, their bodies were found in a heavily wooded area across the county line in Orange County, North Carolina. What investigators discovered at that scene has remained, for more than 50 years, one of the most disturbing and consequential unsolved cases in the state's criminal history. Not because the evidence was absent, not because investigators failed to care or to work, but because everything the crime scene communicated about the person who did this pointed towards someone prepared, deliberate, and experienced enough to never be found. This is the story of Patricia Mann and Jesse McBane. And more than 50 years later, it is still not finished. To understand why this case proved so difficult to crack, you have to understand the state of law enforcement in Durham and Orange County back in 1972. These were not agencies operating with significant shared resources or coordinated infrastructure. The Durham County Sheriff's Department and the Orange County Sheriff's Department were separate entities, separate leadership, separate filing systems. No standardized protocol for joint investigations when a crime crossed their shared border. The Mann-McBane case landed directly in that gap from the beginning. Patricia and Jesse disappeared from the Watts Hospital parking lot area in Durham. That made Durham the originating jurisdiction, the department that held the missing persons reports and the early witness interviews. But the crime itself, the location where they were taken, where they were killed, was in Orange County. The physical evidence, the forensic material, the geography of what actually happened all belonged to a different department than the one that had the initial case file. This split created institutional friction that slowed the investigation from its earliest days. Not the result of negligence or indifference, but the kind of structural friction that forms naturally when two agencies have to negotiate ownership of a shared crisis without a clear protocol telling them how. Both departments worked the case. Working it in genuine coordination proved far harder than it should have been. And while that coordination problem was being worked out, the person who killed Patricia and Jesse had already returned to whatever passed for their normal life. What the Orange County crime scene communicated to investigators was deeply disturbing. The victims had been restrained using rope. The method was not improvised. Whoever brought them to that location had done so with full preparation, which meant they had selected it in advance, which meant they either knew the area well or had scouted it deliberately. The remote woodland in Orange County was not a place anyone stumbled into by accident on a February night. Getting there required knowledge of roads that weren't on most maps, routes that ran dark and unpaved past any point where someone might casually witness what was happening. The cause of death was the result of sustained, deliberate violence carried out over an extended period. Specific details of what was done have been partially withheld from the public record, standard practice in active unsolved homicides, where investigators preserve certain facts so that only someone with direct involvement could confirm them under questioning. What has entered the public record is enough to understand that the scene revealed a level of calculation and cruelty that went far beyond anything consistent with a robbery, a confrontation, or a crime that escalated beyond its original intent. They arrived with total intent. The investigators who processed that scene in February 1972 carried what they found there for the rest of their careers, some of them for the rest of their lives. The immediate investigation in the weeks following the discovery moved with urgency. Investigators interviewed everyone connected to either victim, friends, classmates, nursing school faculty, hospital staff, people who had been at the Valentine's dance, anyone whose name appeared at any edge of the timeline. They looked for someone with a motive, someone whose behavior had shifted in the days before February 12th, someone whose name kept surfacing in more than one context. What they found, consistently, was an absence of any lead that went anywhere with traction. No threatening correspondence had reached either Patricia or Jesse before their disappearance. No pattern of unwanted attention from any identifiable person. No confrontations, no disputes, nothing in either of their lives that suggested they had been targeted by someone they knew. The people who knew them described two individuals who were liked and connected and not in conflict with anyone who could be named. That absence was clarifying in a troubling way. If this was not personal, if the person who took them had not selected them because of who they were specifically, but because of what they represented as a couple, visible and together in a parking lot late at night, then the investigation had a different problem than it had started with. It wasn't looking for someone with a grievance against Patricia Mann or Jesse McBane. It was looking for someone who had been hunting for exactly this kind of target. That realization shifted everything about how investigators thought about the case. And it raised a question that had no comfortable answer. Had this person done something like this before? And if not before, would they do it again? The 1970s were an exceptionally dark era for American crime, and the structural conditions of that decade made it genuinely hospitable to violent offenders who moved across geographic boundaries. Law enforcement agencies across the United States had no shared database connecting crimes between counties or states. An investigator in Orange County, North Carolina, had no reliable mechanism for knowing what an investigator in a neighboring state had seen 6 months earlier or what cases in other jurisdictions shared characteristics with their own. Several of the most prolific killers in American history were active during this period and went unidentified for years because of exactly this gap. They moved. The information about them didn't. A pattern of violence that stretched geographically could remain invisible to every individual investigator even as it accumulated across years, because no single person had wide enough visibility to see the whole shape of it. Any investigator working the Mann-McBane case in 1972 was operating inside this same structural blindness. If the person responsible had done something similar elsewhere, before February 1972 or after it, there was no mechanism that would have surfaced the connection. The Orange County case existed in effective isolation, not because investigators lacked curiosity about broader patterns, but because the infrastructure needed to explore those patterns had not yet been built. This context matters because it explains, without excusing, how someone capable of what was done in those Orange County woods could potentially have moved through years of American life without appearing on any investigator's radar as a repeated offender. The system that might have caught them didn't exist yet. By the time modern investigative infrastructure developed, the leads from 1972 had gone cold in ways that were very difficult to reverse. Active investigation continued through the mid-1970s before the case slowed significantly. The files were preserved. The evidence was stored. The case number remained open in the Orange County records. But the daily work of pursuing it wound down as the available leads ran dry and the tools of the era reached their limits. The transformation of forensic science between 1972 and the late 1990s is difficult to overstate. DNA analysis, which had not existed as a practical investigative tool when Patricia Mann and Jesse McBane were killed, became standard in criminal investigations and then continued developing into something far more powerful than its earliest applications. Techniques emerged for recovering biological material from old evidence that had spent decades in storage, material that had never been analyzed because the capacity to analyze it hadn't existed when it was first collected. Cold case units began forming across the country during this period, staffed by investigators with the mandate and the time to reopen old files with new tools. In North Carolina, this process eventually reached the Mann-McBane evidence, and what it found there changed the trajectory of the entire case. The rope used to restrain the victims at the Orange County crime scene had been in storage since February 1972. It had been collected, logged, and carefully preserved by investigators who understood it was significant evidence even when they had no way to extract everything it contained. Decades passed. The rope sat in storage while the science needed to read it slowly caught up. In 2018, forensic analysts successfully recovered DNA from that rope, biological material that had somehow survived nearly 5 decades of storage and still held readable information about the person who had handled it, who had brought it to that location, who had used it. Orange County investigators confirmed the development publicly, and ABC 11 reported on it. This changed everything. For the first time since February 1972, there was evidence that could definitively connect a specific individual to the Orange County crime scene. Not witness testimony subject to challenge. Not circumstantial connections open to interpretation. DNA, the kind of evidence that speaks in a language courts understand without ambiguity. And investigators had someone specific they wanted to compare it against. A former local doctor who had worked at the hospital in the area where Patricia and Jesse disappeared had been a person of significant investigative interest for some time. The details that drew attention to him, his presence in the relevant geography, his access to the area around Watts Hospital, behavioral and circumstantial factors that aligned with what the crime scene suggested about the perpetrator, had placed him on investigators' radar well before the 2018 DNA recovery. The rope evidence intensified that focus considerably. Modern forensic tools were brought to bear on the question of whether this individual's DNA matched what had been extracted from the 1972 evidence. Investigators who had worked this case across decades, some of them carrying it through the entirety of their professional careers, were engaged in the comparison with a seriousness that reflected how close this felt to a resolution that had seemed, for most of the past 50 years, permanently out of reach. Then the suspect died. Before an arrest. Before charges. Before any courtroom proceeding that would have required him to answer, publicly and under oath, for what the evidence suggested he had done on a February night in 1972. He died, and with that death went the possibility of a prosecution, the specific legal acknowledgement, the verdict, the formal record that Patricia Mann and Jesse McBane's families had been waiting more than 40 years to see. Whether the DNA recovered from that rope conclusively matched the deceased suspect is information that has not been fully released into the public record. What is confirmed is that investigators considered him a serious person of interest, that the modern forensic analysis was conducted with that comparison in mind, and that the window for any prosecution closed before the process could reach a courtroom. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of cold case investigations that almost reach their endpoint. The worst outcome is not the permanent absence of evidence. Evidence can still emerge decades later, as this case proved. What is harder to survive, as an investigation, is developing the evidence, recovering the DNA, identifying a suspect, closing in on something that finally looks like accountability, and then watching the clock run out on the possibility of a trial before it gets there. That is what happened here. Not a failure of forensic science, which delivered exactly what it promised. Not a failure of investigative will, which sustained this case across 5 decades when it would have been easy to let it fade. A failure of timing alone, which is something no investigator, no prosecutor, and no grieving family has any power to control. The families of Patricia Mann and Jesse McBane have carried this case for their entire adult lives. Parents who raised them spent more years without an answer than they spent with their children alive. Whatever closure means in the context of a murder that was never prosecuted, they have not had access to even the most minimal version of it. A verdict, a name spoken in a courtroom, a legal record that acknowledges what was done and by whom. The case remains open. The DNA is on record. In a landscape where forensic genealogy continues to advance rapidly, where the technique that identified the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years is now being applied to cold cases across the country, where the science of connecting biological evidence to family trees grows more precise every year, the DNA recovered from that rope is not a sealed door. It remains an active question that the science may yet be equipped to finish answering, even with the primary suspect gone. Patricia Mann was 21 years old. She was good at her work, present in the lives of the people around her, looking forward to a future she had spent real time building toward. Jesse McBane was 23, warm, easy to be around, the kind of person others gravitated toward without quite knowing why. They went to a dance on a February night and did not come home. What was done to them in those Orange County woods was deliberate and sustained, carried out by someone who brought the necessary restraints and a chosen location and the clear intention to do exactly what they did. That person has never stood in a courtroom. Whether they ever will, whether the DNA on that rope, run against the expanding databases of forensic genealogy, will eventually surface a connection that leads somewhere new, remains genuinely open. The investigators who have carried this case have not treated it as finished. North Carolina has not closed it. The evidence is there. The science to read it is better now than it has ever been. And the question of who took Patricia Mann and Jesse McBane from a parking lot in Durham on Valentine's night in 1972, who drove them across a county line into the dark, who carried out what the crime scene recorded with a level of deliberate intent that investigators never forgot. That question has not yet received the answer it demands. Not yet. But the rope remembers. And the science, finally, knows how to listen.